Here is something almost nobody wants to admit. Most people who earn a modest salary are not poor because of their paycheck. They are poor because of a set of invisible decisions they make every single day, decisions so automatic that they no longer feel like decisions at all. And most people who eventually build real wealth on an ordinary income are not doing anything mysterious. They have simply stopped participating in a psychological pattern that keeps everyone else stuck. So let's ask the uncomfortable question directly. If income were the real determinant of wealth, then every high earner would be rich, and every modest earner would stay poor. But that is not what happens. Plenty of people who earn six figures are one emergency away from disaster, drowning in obligations that expand exactly as fast as their income does. And plenty of people who earn a fraction of that amount quietly accumulate more security, more freedom, and more optionality than people who make 3 times as much. The difference was never really about the number on the paycheck. It was about what happens in the mind the moment that paycheck arrives. This is where we have to go deeper than the usual advice. Spend less than you earn. Invest early. You have heard this 1,000 times, and hearing it has changed almost nothing, because the problem was never a lack of information. The problem is psychological, and until you understand the mechanism underneath your financial behavior, no amount of advice will stick. So let's look underneath. Here is the pattern almost nobody notices in themselves, even though they notice it instantly in others. When income rises, spending rises with it, almost automatically, almost invisibly. Psychologists call this lifestyle inflation, but that phrase makes it sound like a passive economic drift, like weather. It is not passive. It is driven by something much more personal. The way we use spending to construct an identity. Think about what a purchase actually communicates, not just to other people but to yourself. A new car does not just get you from one place to another. It tells a story about who you are becoming. A slightly nicer apartment does not just provide shelter. It signals, to your own mind, that you are moving up, that you are not falling behind, that you are still someone who matters. This is not vanity. This is a basic human need for status and belonging, wired into us by millions of years of group living, where falling behind the tribe genuinely threatens survival. So when your income increases, the temptation to upgrade your lifestyle is not simply a financial impulse. It is an identity impulse. You are not just buying an object. You are buying a temporary sense of having arrived. And that is precisely why this trap is so dangerous for people building wealth on a modest income. If you wait for a someday salary increase to start saving, you will find that the moment it finally arrives, your mind will already be primed to spend it, because your sense of self has quietly attached itself to the next visible upgrade, rather than to the invisible number growing in an account somewhere. Here is the strategic insight this produces. The people who accumulate wealth on ordinary incomes are not the ones with superhuman willpower. They are the ones who understood, early, that their spending is a reflection of identity, and they consciously chose to build an identity around a different kind of signal. Not what they display, but what they control. This is a subtle but total shift. Instead of asking, what does this purchase say about who I am to other people? They learn to ask, what does this decision say about who I am to myself in 5 years? That single question, repeated enough times, rewires the entire relationship between income and identity. There is a second mechanism running beneath the first, and it is even more fundamental. Human beings are, by nature, terrible at valuing the future. Behavioral scientists describe this as present bias, the tendency to weigh an immediate reward far more heavily than a future one, even when the future reward is objectively larger. This is not a character flaw unique to people who struggle financially. It is a universal feature of how the human brain evolved, tuned for a world where immediate resources meant immediate survival, and where the future was measured in days, not decades. But here is what makes this bias so dangerous in a modern economy. Your future self is, psychologically speaking, almost a stranger to you. Studies of how the brain responds to imagining a future version of yourself show something remarkable. It activates in patterns closer to how we think about a different person entirely, not our present self. This means that when you choose to spend today instead of saving for tomorrow, you are not simply being selfish. You are, in a very real neurological sense, prioritizing yourself over someone who feels like a distant acquaintance. The you of 10 years from now, This is why willpower alone rarely works as a long-term financial strategy. Willpower is a battle fought moment by moment against a bias built into the architecture of the brain, and battles fought over and over, day after day, are battles you will eventually lose through simple exhaustion. The people who succeed on modest incomes do not rely on willpower as their primary tool. They rely on something smarter. They make the future self feel less like a stranger and more like someone whose well-being they are personally responsible for today. How do they do this practically? They make the future concrete. They give it a name, a number, a date, an image. Instead of a vague goal like save more money, they build a specific picture. This account is for the version of me who no longer has to accept work out of desperation. This fund is for the version of me who can leave a harmful situation without financial fear controlling the decision. When the future self becomes vivid and specific rather than abstract, the brain begins treating that future self less like a stranger and more like someone worth protecting, which quietly reduces the pull of present bias without requiring constant willpower. This brings us to a question that most people never ask because they assume the answer is obvious. If only I earned more, I would finally be able to save. It feels true. It is rarely true. And understanding why it is rarely true is one of the most important psychological realizations a person can have about money. The reason is what we might call the reference point problem. Human perception is not absolute. It is relative to a baseline constantly recalibrating. This is true of temperature, of sound, of pain, and it is true of income. When your income rises, your financial reference point rises with it, almost immediately, and what once felt like an enormous amount of money now feels ordinary. The lifestyle that once seemed unimaginable becomes the new baseline within months, sometimes weeks. This is why people describe wealthy individuals who still feel financially anxious, and why lottery winners so often end up, a few years later, in situations no better and sometimes worse than before they won. If your relationship with money is built entirely around your reference point, rather than around a fixed set of principles, then no income will ever feel like enough, because the goalposts move automatically the moment you get close to them. This is the deep reason why chasing a higher salary, on its own, rarely produces wealth. It solves the wrong problem. It treats the issue as a lack of resources, when the real issue is an absence of a stable, principle-based relationship with the resources you already have. The strategic shift here is significant. Instead of building your financial life around your current or future income, you build it around a fixed percentage, a fixed principle, a fixed rule that does not move no matter what your income does. Some people call this paying yourself first. But the deeper insight is not the mechanic of automatic transfers. It is the psychological decision to detach your saving behavior from your reference point entirely, so that a raise no longer means more to spend, but instead means more going toward the version of my life I am actually building. Now we need to go somewhere most financial advice refuses to go. The emotional meaning money holds for different people, often without their awareness. For some people, spending is about proving something to a version of themselves that once felt inadequate. For others, spending is a form of self-soothing after a stressful day, a way of regulating emotion through acquisition, the same way some people regulate emotion through food, or through certain habits that provide quick relief and slower cost. For others still, spending is about connection. Buying things for people they love, sometimes generously, sometimes as an unconscious way to secure affection or approval. None of these patterns make someone weak or foolish. They make someone human. But awareness changes everything, because an unexamined emotional pattern controls you, while an examined one becomes a choice. If you notice that your spending spikes specifically after moments of stress, loneliness, or comparison with someone else's life, you have found the actual lever. The lever was never spend less. The lever is understanding what emotional need the spending was quietly satisfying, and finding a way to meet that need directly, without routing it through your bank account. This is where boundaries become relevant. Not just boundaries with other people, but boundaries with your own impulses. A healthy boundary is not suppression. Suppressing an urge to spend simply builds pressure that tends to explode later, often in a larger and less controlled way. A genuine boundary comes from clarity, knowing exactly what you are protecting and why, so that the decision to hold back does not feel like deprivation. but like loyalty to something you have already decided matters more. There is another layer beneath all of this, one shaped almost entirely by the people around you. Human beings evaluate their own progress not in absolute terms, but in comparison to their surrounding social group. This mechanism once helped small tribes coordinate resources and status fairly. In a modern world saturated with visibility into other people's lifestyles, it has become one of the most destructive financial forces that exists, because the comparison never stops, and the group you are comparing yourself to keeps expanding to include people whose circumstances you cannot see clearly and whose finances you do not actually know. Someone earning a modest salary who compares their life to curated images of other people's spending will almost always feel behind, regardless of how well they are actually doing. This feeling of being behind creates urgency, and urgency creates impulsive financial decisions, because urgency narrows the mind's focus to the immediate present and away from long-term reasoning. The strategically self-aware response to this is not to pretend comparison does not affect you. Pretending does not work, because the mechanism is unconscious and automatic. The response is to consciously choose your reference group. If your internal comparison point becomes the version of yourself from a year ago, rather than a stranger's visible lifestyle, the entire emotional charge around money changes. Progress against your own past becomes measurable, motivating, and largely within your control. Progress against an ever-shifting external standard is neither measurable nor within your control, and chasing it is a permanent, unwinnable competition. Once these psychological patterns are understood, the practical mechanics become almost simple, because they no longer require constant emotional resistance. The person who has separated their identity from their spending, who has made their future self vivid, who has fixed their saving behavior to a stable rule instead of a moving reference point, who understands their own emotional spending triggers, and who has chosen their comparison group deliberately, finds that consistency becomes almost natural rather than a constant fight. And consistency applied over time does something that feels almost unfair when you first understand it. It compounds. A modest amount, invested consistently over decades, grows not in a straight line but in a curve that accelerates as time passes, because growth builds on previous growth. This is precisely why starting early carries more weight than starting large. Someone earning a modest salary who begins in their 20s will in most cases end up with more than someone earning triple their salary who begins in their 40s, purely because of how much longer the growth curve had to accelerate. Time, not income, is the primary resource in wealth building, and time is the one resource that a modest salary does not restrict at all. This reframes the entire question behind the title. The path to building real wealth on a low salary was never about extracting more money from a limited income through extreme sacrifice. It was about protecting a small, consistent portion of that income from the psychological forces that would otherwise consume it, and giving that portion enough time to work. There is a broader principle underneath everything we have discussed, one that extends far beyond money: the difference between responding and reacting. A reaction is immediate, emotional, and automatic. It is triggered by an external event and skips the step of conscious evaluation entirely. A response is chosen. It still acknowledges the emotion, but it inserts a moment of awareness between the trigger and the action. Almost every financial mistake we have discussed in this speech is underneath a reaction rather than a response. The impulsive purchase after a hard week is a reaction. The lifestyle upgrade the moment income rises is a reaction. The urgency created by comparing yourself to others is a reaction. What separates the person who quietly builds wealth on an ordinary income from the person who does not is rarely intelligence or luck. It is the practiced ability to notice the reaction forming and to insert one deliberate breath of awareness before acting on it. This single skill, practiced consistently, changes almost every domain of life, not just finances. It is the same skill that improves relationships, career decisions, and self-respect. Money simply happens to be one of the clearest arenas where the cost of reacting instead of responding becomes visible, measurable, and compounding. Let's go one layer deeper still, because there is something underneath even the psychology of money: the relationship between financial behavior and self-respect. When a person builds even a small amount of consistent savings on a modest income, Something changes in them that has nothing to do with the money itself. They begin to trust themselves. They begin to see themselves as someone whose word to their own future self actually means something. This is a form of self-respect that external validation can never provide because it does not depend on anyone else noticing or approving. It depends entirely on the private, repeated evidence that you follow through on what you decide, even when no one is watching, even when it would be easier not to. This is the real distinction between confidence and arrogance that matters here. Arrogance needs an audience. It requires other people to notice the car, the clothing, the lifestyle, in order to feel real. Confidence needs no audience at all. It is built quietly, through a private history of promises kept to yourself, and it shows up not as display, but as calm. The person who has built financial security on a modest income, even a small amount, often carries a quiet steadiness that has nothing to do with how much they have and everything to do with how consistently they have honored their own decisions. Every financial decision you make is really a vote for a specific version of yourself. This is easy to say and difficult to feel, because the effects of any single decision are invisible in the moment. No single dinner out, no single impulsive purchase, no single missed month of saving will ever visibly change your life. This is exactly what makes the pattern so dangerous. The damage is never delivered in a single moment large enough to notice. It is delivered in thousands of small, forgettable moments that accumulate into an entire decade, and then you look up and wonder where the time went. But the same is true in the other direction, and this is the part worth sitting with. No single disciplined decision will visibly change your life either. The version of you who builds real wealth on a modest income is not created in one dramatic moment of willpower. That version is built the same way the opposite version is built, through thousands of small, forgettable decisions, each one nearly invisible on its own, each one a quiet vote for who you are choosing to become. This means the real question was never, how can I become a millionaire on a low salary? That framing focuses on the destination, and destinations do not create discipline. They only create temporary motivation that fades within weeks. The real question is smaller and far more powerful. Who do I choose to become today, in the next decision I make with the money in front of me, regardless of how small that decision appears? Here is the realization worth carrying with you after this ends. Wealth was never primarily a financial outcome. It is a psychological one, expressed through numbers. The account balance is simply the visible residue of an invisible pattern. How you relate to your future self, how you handle comparison, how you regulate emotion, how you define your own identity apart from what you display to others. This means the question, how do I become wealthy on a low salary, was, from the very beginning, the wrong shape of question. The real question underneath it is this: can you become someone whose daily decisions are no longer controlled by unconscious psychological patterns, but are instead guided by clear, chosen principles? If you can answer that question honestly, the income you currently earn matters far less than you have been led to believe. The salary was never the ceiling. The unexamined mind was the ceiling all along. And the moment you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it, and neither can your bank account, not 5 years from now, not 10, not for the rest of your life.